And that question is from the young person. There is a generation gap between how we do things versus how our parents did it. This can be raising kids, caring for a baby, deciding on careers, savings versus expenses. And now especially matters like social justice and racism. Any suggestions on how we can engage our parents without discord?
Okay. It may not always be possible to be without discord, but if you approach it with respect and curiosity and interest, I think it goes much better. So like, don't be afraid of them, but respectfully invite discussion. Ask them why they have the opinions they have. Ask them to share their memories, things they know, and don't assume they're always wrong. There is wisdom in age because older people have experienced more life. So consider the possibility they might know a little more about some of these things than the young person would. But, you know, I guess just be open and interested and listen to them and hear them out before you try to tell them your side. We actually, with couples all the time, we don't always do this, but I always threaten to do this. I always threaten to bring in that talking stick and say, whoever's holding the talking stick talks till they're done, and whoever's listening listens until they can tell the talker what they said. I mean, we're just terrible at listening. And so if you really go into that discussion listening first, listening to hear and understand, it'll probably go better than a direct confrontation. Does that make sense?
And I would add to that, we need to extend the benefit of the doubt to our parents.
Yeah.
I mean, they know what they know, and they live through what they live through, and they're not really going to have a way of understanding how things have changed. And things do change from generation. I agree that I don't think it's possible to not have some kind of conflict between generations. The music changes. The technology certainly has changed. People haven't, but how they express themselves, the latest fads and the kind of things that parents tend to get into conflicts with their kids over, those things are guaranteed to change. So I think listening to them and valuing what they've lived through, and maybe even drawing some parallels between what they've experienced and what we're experiencing currently. For example, racial tensions and racial strife and bigotry have been a part of this culture forever. And I wasn't very big when it happened, but we had a lot of issues with racial strife in the 60s, and my parents lived through that. We've lived through a few wars, but they were around when the Second World War was on and when the Korean War came. So there's parallels between what's happening. In other words, there's nothing new under the sun. Can we make those connections so it doesn't feel like they don't understand or they feel like we don't understand what's gone through? I think we have a lot more in common than what we may think.
So maybe focusing on what they do have in common rather than what they don't have in common, because generationally, by definition, you're not going to see eye to eye on a lot of things.
But focus on understanding them first before you ask them to understand you.
Well, with it, I'd say you've got to pick your battles too. I know raising our children, there were just some things that I wasn't going to the mat for, and she's not going to the mat for, so you got to be careful what you decide, especially when it comes to things that are variable like fashion and all kinds of trendy things that will eventually go all the way around.
Hair color.
You know, the stuff I grew up, fashions are now coming back around. I mean, who knew, right? So there's some things that really aren't worth creating conflict over. Other things like character and those kinds of issues, a whole issue of lying to your parents, that's a big ticket item.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that, you know, I'd love to have a conversation piece geared towards the older generation, helping them understand the younger, because I think the younger generation is more open to dialoguing and more open to processing and working things out, much more so than the older generation. But so it sounds like, depending on how your parents are, it's just pick your battles. Be respectful, and be willing to learn and listen to them. And even if they say things that you don't necessarily agree with, or just either
start with understanding.
Rather than going at it from like an argumentative or discord fashion, because that doesn't lead anywhere. When it becomes an argument and you go down that path, then game over. already.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, I want to also talk about not just a generational divide, but there's a cultural divide between parents and children that's kind of unique to the immigrant families. And these questions are predominantly came from the Asian American young adults who've experienced not just a generational divide, but a cultural dissonance, so to speak, with the parents. And so I think especially many immigrant families in the Asian community, they have additional parent-child relationships, mainly because of the enormous expectation that they place upon their children. And when these expectations aren't met from the parents' perspective, then it's on the kids. It's somehow like, it's not that we failed or maybe we didn't do this rightly, it's on the child. It's always about the child. So here are some of the things that are very common in the Asian community. We've sacrificed so much to give you a better life, and incredible sense of disappointment and guilt that is communicated to the kids. Look at so-and-so, look at the college that kid went to, look at what he's doing, look at how much money he's making or she's making, and look at you. So there's that shaming. We came with nothing, almost $100 in our pockets. It varies. It could be 100, it could be 200 or 300, but it's always kind of the same. And yet you had everything given to you, every opportunity that we haven't got. So why aren't you grateful? Why are you unhappy? Why are you complaining? Yeah. And there's a lot of that whole blaming. So within this context, here are some of the questions that came out. How do I, in a healthy way, come to terms with the way my parents raised me, as well as their idea of success, and forge a life vision of my own?
Well, I'm glad you talked about what the older parents would say, because a number of the things they were doing to me are unhealthy, illegitimate manipulations to make me feel guilty and bad and incompetent and ungrateful. And that's a dead end emotionally. It can be motivating, but in a very negative way. But it also creates a great deal of shame. It creates a great deal of performance expectation. And then the pressure would be enormous. Anytime you compare one child to another child, which in my view is always a mistake, the child's always going to come out on the losing end of that comparison. And the guilt trip part is also illegitimate because I don't think any of the offspring of immigrants, Asian American or otherwise, told their parents to take us to the United States because we want a better life. I mean, that was something the parents chose to do, and yet it feels like the kids are getting tagged for the price on that. So one of the things I would say is we just got to move past the manipulation part. We got to reject that because it's not legitimate, even though it's powerful. I mean, guilt is one of the most powerful motivations ever. I've seen people do some pretty wild stuff because they feel guilty. But at the end of the day, it's not healthy and it's not legitimate. So one thing we can do there, I think, is to take what works for us, take the good, and leave the balance. Not everything our parents tell us is bad or wrong. They got to where they got for a reason. And we need to acknowledge that they have sacrificed. That's all real, and that's true. The part where it's my responsibility to make them feel better about all that, that's the part I got to let go. Because I'll end up doing something to please them, which makes me what? A codependent. I'm trying to make them happy, and I'm not happy, and that's going to end up badly. I'll end up doing something for a profession that I didn't want to do. Because remember, we talked about how different jobs have different socioeconomic value, and of course, parents want us to go right to the top. But what if that's not my heart? So I've got to reject that as a manipulation to force me to do and be somebody I'm not, and not make me a clone of yourself, and not living your life for you. There's another one of those things where we can live anyone's life for them. Right. And they've had their opportunities to do and be what they are. Now it's my turn. And when parents put that guilt on them, try to live their life through their kids. So I think we got to reject the manipulative part of that and untangle ourselves from the guilt trips and say, no, it's a boundary. And say, I'm not responsible for what you chose to do, to come to this country and to do the sacrifice you did. You did that because you love me and you want to do that, but I'm not willing to pay the price for it by performing the way you think I should.
Yeah. This is the perfect content to take to counseling and spend some time working through it. Shame tends to shrink when we can talk about it. Shame it gets more powerful when we keep it as a secret and we can't talk about. The same with guilt and blame. A lot of therapy is actually sorting. I just think of it a bunch of file folders or a bunch of boxes, and I help the client sort through things. And if the guilt or the blame or the shame belongs to their parents, we can put that in the parent box and they can kind of be relieved of it, at least internally. Even though with their parents, I would say to them, don't keep stirring the pot, don't keep getting contentious, look for things you could be grateful for even with your parents. Do the inner work with a good friend, counselor, psychologist, and then and do that work first before you say anything to your parents. And join your parents where you can. They did take care of you for 20 years or so, so be grateful for that.
Yeah, I think what makes it so difficult is because it is so hard to separate out the culture, the cultural dynamics. And so, you know, I think even if someone realizes this is a form of manipulation, this is very, I mean, everybody recognizes it's very unhealthy, but how do you untangle yourself in a way when the other party, like when your parent, you could try to untangle that or even try to behave differently, but the parents are not going to change. Right. The culture isn't going to change. That's all they know. That's how they think success is. You come to a foreign country, this is how you succeed, and you didn't do it, or you're disappointing me. So there's so it's this almost this emotional. It's like when you do it, you're almost cutting off your limb to try to do this. So, and I know it's not saying it can't be done, but it's almost like the individual needs to really call it what it is.
And sometimes you have to create some distance to have the freedom to separate and untangle. That's really hard to do when you got your nose right up against all the family dynamics and expectations. One of the things I really liked about what we did is that after we got married, I got a second undergraduate degree so I could go on to graduate school, and we left everybody and traveled to Los Angeles and spent the next 8 years of our lives there. And that put us on our own. I mean, we had contact with our family and they visited, but it was us. What's that?
Not much.
They didn't get out much, that's true. But we had to forge our own identity and forge our own relationship. And that was a distance that was helpful for us. I value that time. And not having to deal with all the family dynamics and getting drawn into some of the family dramas that we certainly probably would have been part of if we'd lived back here in the East Coast. So creating distance, sometimes you have to do it. It may be hurtful and the parents may not understand the need for it, but you can't untangle yourself when you're just right up against and you're feeling the pull into the family dysfunctions. And that close to guilt is going to slime you at least.
So how do you handle guilt? How would you advise?
Is it true or false? You think through it. Is this true guilt? Am I truly guilty, or is it false guilt? False guilt is accusatory, and we often internalize that. Maybe the parents are accusing us first, but then we tell ourselves, I'm dumb, I wasn't the valedictorian, I'm stupid. We do it to ourselves, and anytime that guilt it's almost like a wheel, and every time it goes around, it hits you. That's accusation, that's false guilt. And we need to, again, we were talking about this earlier, observe that our own thinking so we can capture that thought, choose to disagree with it, and choose to replace it with the truth. If there's true guilt in there, we should feel remorseful and change something. But a lot of it's false guilt.
And that's where therapy is very helpful, to have an objective third party who understands what's true guilt, what's false guilt, to say, no, that's not yours. That belongs to someone else. You need to give it back to them and not keep picking it up again. Okay, the fact is you don't owe this to your parents. You're not responsible for their well-being or their happiness by performing the way they want you to. So it's important that it come from someone outside the family who can see it objectively.
So within that context of a parent who may or may not, most likely not respond well to this next question, the question is, how do I or should I confront a parental figure who has deeply hurt me in my childhood?
Well, again, you better do your work first so that you're in a place to do that. You better sort through all your stuff and come from a place of compassion and confidence. And you can't do that unless you've really done all that sorting, what's theirs, what's mine, taking responsibility for your own, giving it back. And you better do all that first before you go there. You could invite them to counseling to help you. You could maybe come up with an analogy that might help them understand. One thing I thought of is, for generations, you meticulously cared for this bonsai tree in this little container. And then you moved to America, you took it out of the container, and you planted it in the forest, and it's competing with cedars and oak trees, and it's going to grow like crazy so it can reach some sunlight. It is going to change. How it's going to die if it stays the same. I don't know if you can come up with like a metaphor like that, but just do your work first. Watch your expectations and how needy you might be feeling. Be at a place where you're not feeling needy. You can just accept them where they're at and peel off or reject all the guilt, shame, and blame, and reach out with something, but don't do it when you're not ready.
I think we have to be compassionate toward our parents and understanding they have a lot invested in us. They have truly, deeply invested in our lives, and they made sacrifices. And having been a parent long enough, I get that. I don't think I understood that when I was much younger because I hadn't been through that. So we want to respect it without saying, therefore I owe you to be that person you want me to be. We've just got to understand that, yes, I respect that. Thank you, Mom and Dad. But I need to be who I am. And I may need to create some distance. And like Rachel just said, we got to watch our expectations. If we expect them to validate us and affirm us and say, oh, go in peace, my son, that's probably not going to happen. It's going to take a lot of work for them to truly accept that you're your own person, need to go the other direction.
Well, when someone tried to do that, someone that I know well, it just totally blew up. And what came back was, you are such an ungrateful daughter. You are corrupted by the culture. And this, you would never treat me this way if we were in our, in our old country. So, but I think this whole, what you're saying though is really important, expectations. But most of all, being ready, being in a healthy place, so expecting the worst, but yet, and when the worst happens, being able to deal with that in a healthy manner, and having support.
Yes,
I think that's very, very important, because when even with best intentions, when it happens, it's going to affect you. To have your parents look at you and just lash out at you.
Yeah, that support is really important.
The support, I think, is going to be
so
critical.
that you can leave well.
Right.
So you have something there to leave. If the bottom drops out from under you with your parents, you have your second family.
The other question is, how do I, and this could be more in a general sense, but how do I identify behaviors and thought patterns that are related to childhood wounds?
Well, one of the things we have to look at is when we overreact to something. That should be a clue to us. Like, for example, if the situation called for this and I erupt with that, I need to ask myself, what's the rest of this about? Somehow I got triggered. And so that's when you start looking inside and going, what was that about? Why did I have such a big response? So we need to find our triggers. And they're there. Sometimes people around us will say, whoa, dude, what was that about? When we overreact to something. And then we start looking backward, like, where did this come from? Is somebody's face coming to mind when I do this? Because when we hear things growing up, we internalize them. And then we start saying them to ourselves in our own voice, which means I'm going to hear myself and think, well, that's me who thinks I should do this or that, or I'm bad if I do this, that. And it turns out it was somebody else. But until I know that, I'm going to keep doing that to myself, So that process of giving that back to the person who told me something that wasn't true, it was inappropriate. Like my 7th grade English teacher told me essentially I was a terrible writer, and I took it in. And later I gave it back to her because it turns out I really do know how to write well enough. So those things have to be reappropriated back to, and that voice needs to go away. But first we got to recognize it and own it. Otherwise we're just replicating our parents' internal stuff, and then we're going to do it to our own kids. And that's when it really gets weird. Good example here, my dad used to say, "Close the door. Were you guys born in a barn?" And surely I told myself I'd never say that to my kids. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But sure enough, when they were probably about 8 or 9 or whatever, they left the front door open, and I said, "Hey, what's wrong with you guys? Were you born in a barn?" I go, "No, I didn't say that. I did not come out of my mouth." But there it was. Yeah. There it was. I'd internalized that. And of course, being the smart Alex they were, they started mooing and making animal noises. So there was that. But it was something that I said I wouldn't do, and boom, there it is. Sure. So if we don't recognize it, we're not going to be able to deal with it and send it back in the past where it belongs.
Right.
Two of the best emotional cues are anger and anxiety. Anger can flash out of nowhere, and we don't even know what happened, and then we start to ask hard questions. Anxiety also. For example, I could be watching a TV show, and if something has happened to me, and then I suddenly feel this anxiety. I don't even know why. So triggers are all around us. If you start saying, "Oh man, every time that happens, I really get upset, I really get anxious. When that happens over here, I get upset again," there's a pattern you need to look at and say, what's going on with me? Where's this coming from? I could watch other shows and not have that, but when that happens on this television show or this movie, I get this big reaction. What's that about? Right. It's about something.
Right.
Oftentimes, the trigger is to a trauma, and then the trauma gets sort of like encased inside of your soul. And if you don't identify that, it sort of like the driver in the driver's seat kind of running you, and you don't even know it's happening.
Right, because it's out of conscious awareness.
Yeah.
Because part of what we do in therapy is help make the unconscious conscious.
Right.
So we ask the kind of questions like Rachel's talking about. How old do you feel when it happens? Oh yeah, and then the memory can return. Right. And now we can deal with something that actually happened that left a really negative impact on someone.
Yeah, good stuff. So the next question is, how do I draw boundaries in a healthy way? And again, I want to give you a little bit of that cultural context. So drawing boundaries is really a Western concept. And there's been books written about it. It was very popular. There was some popular book way back when about boundaries. It was called Boundaries, okay? But in the traditional, a lot of immigrant cultures, but especially in the Asian culture, parents have that final authority. It's very hierarchical. So you could be older by 1 month, but I'm still older than you. That kind of, that age is a huge factor, but certainly that established parental authority, or whether it's your boss, or whether it's your professor, it's just a built-in hierarchy that exists. So since that's so intrinsic to the people and to the culture, drawing boundaries is just a very foreign concept in a traditional sense. So I'm just curious, knowing that, what could you advise this young person who's asking this question?
First, I want to say, I guess I feel their pain, and I haven't grown up in that culture, so I'll speak to it with what I would say that would be helpful, and I hope it's helpful, because I haven't grown up in that culture. But the work of boundaries is actually defining work. A boundary is, let's take a property line. And this is actually from that Boundaries book. That's Henry Cloud and John Townsend, excellent authors. But let's take a property line. The line, it might be on a map. The surveyors might have it. It's just a defining line. It just defines where the property line stops. The fence is the visual kind of representation of where the property line stops, and it acts as an enforcer of the boundary. So a lot of times when people say, you have to set boundaries, or you have to have boundaries. They're thinking about that fence, but way more important than that fence is that line. And when we're talking about boundaries in this sense, we're talking about the line around your identity, who you are, your choices, everything inside your skin. You know, your thoughts, your actions, and the boundary defines what you own, and you are responsible for what you own. On the flip side, you are not responsible for what you don't own. So all this stuff from your parents, while it presses heavy on you, if you really stick with what you own, you can at least inside your mind go, I am not responsible for their response. Even though I say no to them, they're responsible for everything inside their skin. They're responsible for their response. So I don't have to carry that heavy burden of, I made them mad, whatever. You didn't make them. They chose to respond that way. And you are now responsible for your choices and your life and how you move forward in life. So really learning to not take ownership of their stuff, I guess, is a big way to at least give you some internal relief, even if it doesn't change them. Does that make sense?
And I think I see boundaries as not having really much to do with culture itself. And I certainly understand that in certain cultures, like the Asian cultures, you're not allowed to set boundaries because the hierarchy, the parents trump boundaries. But that doesn't change the fact that I have boundaries and that I need to have those boundaries to be who I am and to function as a person. So, I mean, there's reasons I don't go over in my neighbor's yard and start messing with his flowers and start digging stuff up. It's not my property.
Right.
Nor would I allow him to come over and mess around with my yard. So some of this is recognize these boundaries are just inherent in life and in personhood. And even though they've been commonly breached and commonly busted down by my culture, that doesn't change that boundary. Even though they say, well, it's my right to play in your yard. And I would have to say, no, it's not. This is my yard. And find ways to defend my boundaries and say, I'm not okay with you doing that. That's not appropriate. That's not right. And that may fly directly in the face of cultural expectations. And you may be just considered a terrible, awful person to essentially say, no, it's not okay for you to come over in my yard. This is my yard. And it was my yard from the day I was born. It's mine. And you need to go over to your yard. And that's not an easy process. And there's going to be a lot of mess and disconnection when you do that.
Yeah, and when you start thinking through all this and doing the defining work, I think the temptation is to over-respond. But a healthy boundary, let's take that fence, it has some flexibility built in. So that fence has a gate. And ideally, you open the gate and let good in. And you close the gate and keep bad out. That's ideal. But learning not to be too rigid, especially when we're making changes. Learning to be more flexible. Other thing that the boundaries authors talk about, John Townsend and Henry Cloud, is one way to sort of sort through it is to think about being responsible to and being responsible for. We're responsible for ourselves. But we still have responsibility towards others, like to be courteous, to be respectful, to be kind, to be honest. So sometimes that helps a little bit in the defining work.
Right. So I think those are all really great points. And I think for this person, if I can't speak for them, but let's say for the sake of discussion, the parents don't respond well, then it's really up to that person to figure out what's going to work for them and how can they work this in a way that they can work, be healthy.
I'm sorry. And another principle of boundary setting is when I'm learning to set boundaries, the temptation is to scream, no. And that's not healthy or helpful because I'm using the nuclear option when I need to say it in just a normal tone, say, please don't do that. We don't start with the nuclear option. And we wait until possibly it could be respected. Sometimes we can enforce them to respect it in the sense that I won't come over to your house unless you respect me when I'm there, and I choose to not be with you then. So we have options, we have choices, but we don't want to start with the biggest one.
Right.
Okay, and then I guess this is kind of very similar, I guess, to this question is how can I be there for my parents and care for them without getting too attached?
But I think what we've been talking about,
Yeah.
setting boundaries and enforcing them, go into that as well. Because I'm kind of visualizing taking care of somebody, but they want you to stay longer. And you don't want to stay longer. So you got to be clear that I'll be leaving at 2 o'clock and then do that. So some of that is setting the expectations carefully.
Yeah. I wondered, again, these are general questions. I wondered if this person was afraid of grief. Like, am I going to get too attached and then they're going to die and then I can't stand the grief? Grief is a very valuable emotion. It is the only emotion that allows us to accept loss. Depression is actually repressed grief. If we don't grieve and we shove it down, we get depressed. And so I wondered if this person maybe was avoiding pain, the pain of grief, or I don't know. I don't know what
We
it
can
was.
just speculate, but
Yeah.
That was an interesting question.
Yeah.
And lastly, great question, although I did chuckle when I read this. How do I convince my parents to go to therapy?
Well, the short answer is you don't, and you can't.
That's what I wrote.
Right.
You don't.
And you really shouldn't. It's really not about that. So what I would recommend, and I think Rachel would agree with this, is you go to therapy yourself. And you make the changes, you do the work, and if somebody in the family says, hey, you're different, and they want to understand how you're growing and changing, you can share that with them. But you got to do the work first rather than waiting for mom and dad to go, which they may be very hesitant to.
Or may never go. May never end up going.
They may never go, and they may resist every attempt. So is this really a good place to use my energies, is trying to convince them that they're really messed up and they need to go to therapy, because that's not going to go over very well.
Right.
Well, another thing I'd add is I've had situations where other family members needed to come. But I was meeting with somebody, and I said, why don't you invite them in to be a consultant on just how messed up you are? And a number of times it has worked beautifully, because you
great.
get other people in who wouldn't come otherwise to say, tell me about your experience with your son or your daughter or whoever. And then they find out, number one, that I'm not a really scary, terrible person who wants to shrink their head. And they also have an opportunity to get out some of their feelings. So my client hears it, I hear it. And sometimes we'll invite them back for a repeat at some point, but they can be very helpful adjuncts to, and it pulls them into a therapeutic process. And especially if they see their son or daughter changing, and they go, wow, this is different. You're not the same person. Something's going on in that therapy thing.
Right.
So that's one means. It may be a little sneaky, but I've seen it be very effective.
Oh, whatever it takes. That's my motto.